My name is Matthew Phillip. I'm an elder at Anthem Church, and I also am a physician that leads some of our clinical pathways in an 800 physician group dealing and tackling with the threat of the coronavirus. What I wanted to do is share some of the things that we've learned and share things that may be helpful in preventing the spread as well as protecting our loved ones and our community. This is a threat that we haven't faced before, and so we need to absolutely take this seriously, and getting the most up-to-date information out there is going to be critically important. We also have to remember that this is an evolving story, and so in a day or 2 days, the story could change, and so we want to take things in context as we're learning more and updating. The coronavirus is a mutation of a current cold virus that we've all potentially been exposed to in the past. It's in the family of coronaviruses. The specific coronavirus we're talking about with this pandemic is the SARS coronavirus, which is also called COVID-19. This virus originated in China, in Wuhan province, and is spread throughout the world. This is different than other epidemics such as SARS or MERS or H1N1, swine flu, bird flu that you may have heard of before in a few very specific and important ways. One is people can spread it even when they have no symptoms of this virus, which makes it very dangerous. As you can see, it's spread in about 100 countries or more already in just several weeks. One of the important differences is, thankfully, it tends to affect children much less. Children seem to have very mild symptoms, which is great. It also affects pregnant women much less than things like the swine flu. Its mortality rate is also significantly lower than some of those, whereas the MERS infection may have a mortality rate of 20 or 30%, SARS potentially 10% of all people dying. The coronavirus that we're talking about seems to have a mortality rate closer to 1%, but we're hoping that as more testing is available, that it's actually significantly less than 1%. This is something to be thinking about and actively praying about, because we want that mortality rate to be as low as possible, because especially with something that spreads this easily and throughout our communities, the stakes are very high. To give you some context, the flu virus, the seasonal flu that we've all experienced, each person who gets sick on average infects about one other person. With the coronavirus, each person who gets sick affects about 3 additional people. So it's much more contagious than the flu virus. It's also more lethal. Whereas the seasonal flu kills about 0.1% of all people that are infected by it, the SARS coronavirus that we're talking about can kill 0.5 to even 1% of all people that are affected. But again, we need to be praying that we can get those numbers down as low as possible as testing is further expanded. But also, we need to be praying for treatments and vaccines that are currently in development to be sped through the process, for innovation to be happening, because we know that we are a part of God who brings all innovation and all inspiration for us. What makes this virus so dangerous is that it spreads so easily. What we see is that even from touching surfaces that have the virus, then touching our mouth, touching our nose, that we can actually introduce it into our system. It tends to get into our bodies through our nose, mouth, or even eyes. And that's why one of the recommendations to prevent the infection is not touching your face, especially when out in public, before washing your hands. What we see is that it goes in through the nose, mouth, or eyes, especially when people are coughing directly. And so that's why you may have heard the term social distancing, where you want to stay about 6 feet away from other people, especially if they're sick. Separation is important to prevent the spread in terms of if people are coughing. What is also important is, right now, avoiding large gatherings, because the spread of the virus, because it's spreading so easily, it's spreading fast in our community and it's peaking. So a lot of people are getting sick quickly. What we want to do from a public health standpoint and from a pastoral standpoint with our communities is to decrease that peak as much as possible. So the more we can prevent infections from reaching other people, the better we can flatten that peak, spread this out over time, and be able to process the people who are getting sick and are most at risk. When we think of the people who are most at risk, those are specifically what we're finding, at least as of now, is people who are 60 years and older with underlying medical conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, breathing problems like COPD or emphysema, dialysis patients, or people with chronic kidney disease. but also people over 80 years old, even with no underlying medical conditions, are at very high risk. And so we really need, as a faith community, to be our brothers' keepers and our sisters' keepers, and to look out for one another. So if you're sick, please stay home until your symptoms resolve. If you are coughing or sneezing or have a sore throat, consider wearing a mask, especially while in public. And keep in mind those ideas of social distancing, staying at least 6 feet away from other people, avoiding hugs and handshakes, at least right now, washing your hands thoroughly, especially when you're coming back home or leaving. The idea in terms of washing your hands is not just a quick rinse, it's rinsing your hand, having a lather with soap and water, washing your hands for 20 seconds, which is like humming happy birthday twice. That's the amount of washing your hands that's going to be important to prevent this infection from spreading. Our response as a church is the biblical response, which is considering our communities, our parishioners, our greater family to be our brother's keeper and our sister's keeper, to be good neighbors, to love those who are surrounding us. As a church, we've decided to limit our public meetings of a church for the next few weeks, and potentially adjusting how we worship together and how we fellowship together. This initial period of time is so critical with decreasing or flattening the peak of that infection. We want to do our part to be good neighbors and to be a light in this world. That doesn't mean that there aren't things we can do. There's several things we can do. First and most importantly, we need to be praying. We need to be praying for God's intervention in this, because the spread of this virus can be decreased. The virus can also mutate into gentler strains over time, which can decrease the potential of hurting or killing people. And we need to be actively praying for that. We also want to pray for the response of communities to be able to rally together and to protect one another. When we talk about those high-risk groups, 60 and older with underlying medical conditions, we also want to look for opportunities to bless them, to help them with groceries, things that they may need, help them to stay safe as we're riding out this initial first wave. And we also want to be praying for new treatments to be created. There are already some promising treatments in development that can hopefully treat this illness and prevent it from happening altogether. Faith is going to be a critical component of how we respond to this crisis. We're not fearful and panicking like we may see in the media, we may see in the world, we may see in our friends, but our response shouldn't be to ignore a real and present danger that we face in our communities. We want to tackle this with faith in who our God is, His character, His kindness, gentleness, and His real intervention in our lives. When we look at Mark 4, we see Jesus as the God who calms the storms that we face. And the disciples at that time were wondering, do you even care about us? And Jesus' response was, do you know who I am? I think this is a time for us to really cling to who God is, the kind, gentle, and powerful God that can calm this storm and help us bring breakthrough in these times. While there is a balance between not fearing but also taking things seriously, in light of that, we also need to make sure that we are taking this very seriously. This is not an over-exaggeration. This is a real pandemic that's happening. This is something that we haven't seen before in our time and in our communities. This is very different than that. And so we need to be taking this seriously because lives are at stake. When we consider our response, we need to look at how do we prepare? How do we prepare in terms of being able to work from home if possible, staying home if we're sick, communicating with our loved ones to make sure that they're not putting themselves in harm's way. And also our response, as we talked about, as a faith community in terms of praying and preparing for this. But let's be wise during this time of limiting things like travel that could expose us to further and greater risks. Please join us online for church as there are more updates happening, as we can stay connected through our online presence. But we will be sending more updates as they become available. And please let us know if you have any questions or if there's anything we can be doing. But we are praying, we're praying for you and with you.